In a lot of my experience, where I come in to fix a project that is in trouble, it's usually because the company are in trouble, and I see the same repeat issues. I'm a firm believer of losing money on valuable lessons learned. Everyone tries to crush my hand when I'm shaking the hand at the beginning of the meeting. I've had so many circumstances. A director going, "Who the hell is Michelle Carr? Why is she being contractor? We don't need to go down that road." And my client will be, "But that's what I pay her for. You owe me £80,000 or £120,000. I want my money." If you haven't issued the documentation, they can take you to adjudication and you will lose.
Welcome to Taking the Con Out of Construction, the straight-talking show that's changing the industry, one episode at a time. Small mistakes can cost big money, and even more in time. But a small investment in listening to this episode could help you avoid disputes, delays, and costly pitfalls, while giving you the know-how to stop problems before they start. Let's turn complexity into clarity and take the con out of construction.
Welcome back to Taking the Con Out of Construction. Today, we're tackling a topic that can make or break professional relationships: alternative dispute resolution. Michelle, welcome back. We all know that disputes can be costly and time-consuming, but ADR seems to offer a smarter way through. I'm really keen to hear how contractors can use it to find solutions without the courtroom drama.
We discussed it with the Construction Act, and the biggest thing about bringing the Construction Act in was about bringing in adjudication clause. Prior to 1996, the only dispute resolution that was available was litigation or arbitration. Now, arbitration would take years, and one of the key things about the Construction Act was the fact it gave contractors the opportunity of rough justice. ADR is alternative dispute resolution, which is alternative to litigation. So the main one is adjudication that most people use. And adjudication basically is whichever party, got to be client, contractor, subcontractor, sub-subcontractor, whatever it may be. You've got two parties. A dispute has to have crystallized. There is a disagreement. And that could be an application for payment. It could be a design change. It could be a number of different things. There is a protocol. So you have to issue a certain letter with certain information. You have to give a certain time period. There's things that need to be part of that letter. So you've got a pre-action protocol. Then you've got the way that the adjudication is done. So if you're in dispute, you have to get professional advice, because if you don't do it properly, it can literally bite you in the backside, and all your work and the money that you've paid can all be undone because you haven't followed the protocol. So it's quite strict. It's all online. You can find out what you need to do, but ultimately it's quite complicated. And anything legal is its own language and the way it needs to be presented. You need to find a professional. I am a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, so I've got some of the qualifications on adjudication, but I don't prepare them because I choose not to. What I tend to do is have a look at somebody's case to see where they're at. I will often say to people, if you've got a dispute, that the best opportunity is to go to adjudication, mediation, or whatever your options are. I try to avoid a dispute resolution where I need to, but sometimes that's the only option. But then I can tell you where you are and I can help you prepare your case and then go to someone that actually writes adjudication and takes that process for you. When it comes to disputes, things have changed in the last couple of years. So prior to 1996, you had just litigation, and that would cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands potentially. So subcontractors primarily, also main contractors, didn't necessarily have the manpower all the time to go through a lengthy year, 18 months, 2 years process to fight their clients. So they didn't bother because they would have ended up bust, and the only people that win in those situations were the solicitors. So they brought in dispute resolution, and when you've got a dispute and it crystallizes, you follow the protocol. Once you've got an adjudicator and you've sent the relevant information to the person you're adjudicating against, you've got an adjudicator, and that's either because they're written in the contract or the RCS have suggested one. It's in the contract of how you find an adjudicator. Once you've got an adjudicator, you put your case towards them. The adjudicator will turn around and say, yes, I can adjudicate under whichever terms. Now, there is also a second option rather than standard adjudication where the adjudicator would give you your fees. There's now an LVDA, which is a low value dispute adjudication, which is much quicker and the fees are set, and it's also much faster, but it limits the amount of time that an adjudicator may potentially take. As standard, you tell the client you're going to adjudication, you get the adjudicator, you submit the adjudication. You've got 7 days to put your case across. They've got 7 days to respond. The adjudicator then has 14 days to make a decision on that information, which is where the downfall is rough justice. So you could create literally a truckload of documentation for the adjudicator to review, and they've still got 2 weeks. They can ask for an extension, but it is very rough justice. It is legally binding, but it's not enforceable. So if you do get an adjudication, but people don't pay still, it then has to go to litigation and it goes to the court. I've never had it where a court has overturned an adjudication result, and that's how you then enforce it. But most times when an adjudication has been won, unless there's a counter adjudication or another adjudication for whatever reason there may be, and I don't want to go into too many particulars, that is legally binding. It is rough justice because there's a short amount of time the adjudicator has to make a decision, and it's based on the information that's provided. It's a very stressful way around it, and preparing for adjudication is imperative to make sure if you're going to adjudication, you've got all of your ducks in a row, because there's a bit of a struggle with it. I would always recommend people to try mediation first, depending on the circumstances. But because people are becoming more aware of adjudication, and now you've got this low value adjudication, there are situations, and I've had a number of them. If you are a contractor, or even if you're a client, or you're a main contractor, or you're subcontracting, you will have people working for you that are sending applications for payment. If you haven't got systems in place to make sure that you're either certifying on time or issuing a payless notice on time, you're opening yourself up to adjudication. Rightly or wrongly, if a client has put an application for payment in and you haven't certified it and you haven't issued a payless notice, if you don't pay the amount that was applied for, whether that person is entitled to it or not, if you haven't issued the documentation, they can take you to adjudication and you will lose. And not only will you have to pay whatever it is that they've applied for, whether they're entitled to it or not, you're also going to have to pay the adjudication fees. And this is happening all the time. And this is happening because people don't understand their contracts and they're just not issuing the paperwork in time, normally because they either aren't aware, so there's a training issue within your business, or because they don't have the systems in place to support them. This is happening all of the time. There are some people that are taking advantage of this. There are some subcontractors that are basically putting an invoice in or an application for payment in for much more work than they've completed that they're not entitled to, knowing full well that their client isn't going to send them a payless notice. And then the due date comes, they don't have anything, they're entitled to that money. Then if it doesn't get paid, a dispute crystallizes, the next minute they get an adjudication and they're getting the full amount. The client is then likely to counteract, or again with an interim payment, when you've got the application for payment comes in, you've paid it, but then you just wipe it all off and then you just take whatever they're not entitled to out, send a payless notice or whatever it may be, and then the company's got to pay money back, and it gets a little bit complicated. But people need to understand their contracts, which I've said before. You need to understand what you have to do and how to administer a contract properly, because if you don't, and somebody is much more on the ball than you are, you're going to get adjudications and it's expensive. And that's not something you can pass on to the client. That's coming directly out of your profits. So people need to be aware. But ultimately, we should be acting this way anyway. You should have the right team in place. You should have a QS or somebody handling your financial side of things that should be issuing payless notices or payment certificates, that should be on top of things and having a look at variations. And it should be done properly. And there's no reason why it shouldn't unless you've overloaded them. But you must make sure that these things are done properly, because as time goes on, people are getting much more efficient and much more aware. And that's what the Act is for. Okay, they're using it to their advantage in some situations, but then make sure that you're protected. You should be commercially protected. Obviously, it helps to make sure that you understand your contract and it's been negotiated properly in the first place. But if you've got contracts that you don't really understand, it's your duty to learn to understand them. If you can't, you need to employ a professional that does. One of the things that I used to do with my clients, when I'm agreeing their contract, I'd go through their information and say, this is what we need to do, and do a red light system of, no, we're not agreeing to this. This is okay. This is fine. We need to change the wording on this. I then would do a contract synopsis, which would list out exactly what they've agreed to and what they need to do. And with a lot of my clients, I would then implement a system. So, right, this is your payless notice. It has to be issued on this day. This has to be issued that day. This is when this has happened. Quote this clause on this letter, and do some standard templates that are linked to that contract only, because every contract, the majority of the times, is different. And make sure that there's internal training in their team, that they understand. And to be fair, it doesn't necessarily have to be the QS. Your accounts department can do it if necessary. Your teams just need to be communicating, but you have to issue the certification. You have to understand where you're at. Final accounts. I had a client recently that's got 3 final accounts. They're way over where they're supposed to be in the contract. They haven't issued payless notices. I was like, adjudicate. Take them to adjudication. They're now coming up with all these counterclaims that are absolutely unsubstantiated because they just don't want to pay it. They're trying to screw you over. They've had their time. They haven't done what they're supposed to be done properly. You've had a practical completion certificate. You've put in your case. Everything's warranted. They haven't objected to anything. They haven't issued you with any notice. Adjudicate. And that's what they're now doing because they're trying to cut £40,000 off each final account. And bearing in mind, the final accounts are 120,000 each. It's a lot of money for a subcontractor and they don't have that much profit in them. This is what needs to be happening. That's the difficulty. Now, what I would say, and one of my best pieces of advice, if you've got a contract that you sense that there's a bit of an issue between you and either the QS or whoever it is you're agreeing payments with and things are getting a little bit frosty, or even before that stage, you have concerns over your project, I would always recommend speaking to a mediator. I often talk about contracts, dispute resolution, and I refer it to relationships because everyone can relate to that. And I've worked with a number of incredible mediators and they totally agree. When it comes to agreeing a contract, it's great to do it when everybody's friends. Everybody starts as their friends and they're hand in hand or like in little seats next to each other. Then as things move on and things don't quite work out as you expected them to be, people start to step away a little bit. They're turning away from each other. And then all of a sudden the seats start to turn. So they start putting their back on each other and they move further and further away. And you know what's happening, whether it be a friend or a relationship, or maybe things start to get a little bit tense and get a little bit snippy. And then things either work themselves out because you have a straight up conversation and say, listen, you did this and you did that. Sometimes you just spent too much time with your bestie and actually just need a break because you're in your 40s and you're set in your own ways and actually you're not 25 anymore. Sometimes you just need a date night or a weekend away. Things get like that. Now people understand when relationships change. It's the same in business. And when things start to get a little bit tense, you start to feel a little bit nervous. The more nervous you are, and especially if you haven't had a really good contract you've negotiated properly, the more people start to get a little bit nervous and tense. When money's on the line, there's an expectation I'm going to get screwed, because that's what happens in the construction industry. Everyone is worried about getting screwed over because it happens on a daily basis. Everyone's worried about going bust. The media at the moment is all doom and gloom. Everywhere you look, it's ridiculous. And people are getting agitated and people don't want to lose the shirts on their backs. So when things are starting to get a little bit agitated and you're not too sure what's happening, or you've got variations that aren't being necessarily agreed, or you've got your applications for payments are being slashed and things aren't quite comfortable, that's always a good stage to get a mediator. Now, a mediator obviously does cost, but the idea of a mediator is they're impartial and actually gives you an opportunity to present your case and what you're concerned about and what is not quite right. And if there's a few issues with the design or the client or changes, but you can feel that things are getting a little bit awry, it's really good to try and go to mediation, because one, that's going to be pretty cheap, and two, it actually gets the conversation back on track. And whether you actually go to official mediation or just have a conversation and say, look, let's meet up, let's have a conversation. Because as I've said so many times before, you need to keep the human element of the contract going. You are people at the end of the day, and understand that people have bad days or could be having relationship issues, whether that makes sense or not, and it's not professional. It's just how life is. And having a conversation with someone, and I always recommend this to my clients. We spoke about final accounts last week. Always be communicating, be human, and have conversations with people and create those bonds and be honest. Obviously, as I've said a number of times, you have to be delivering. But even if you're not delivering, have a conversation with someone, mediate if necessary. Hold your hands up and say, we haven't done this, but turn it around. Just because something's not quite right, or you've had a bad egg on your team, or somebody's let you down, or a supplier's gone bust, or whatever it may be for the reason, have some authenticity. It doesn't always work out, and there's always people in there that will take advantage of it. But for me, in the last 20 years, being authentic has never really done me harm, except maybe ruin some relationships or detach me from people that I really shouldn't have been involved in the first place. Yes, it can cost you money, but I'm a firm believer of losing money on valuable lessons learned. But mediation is always great, especially if you've got a mediator. So if you are concerned about someone ripping you off, or they're not exactly the most ethical person, by all means get a mediator involved, because a mediator will write a report and they are impartial. Regardless who brought them in, they are impartial. And they will look at both sides of it. They understand how things are. They look at the contract and they come up with a decision. And sometimes that's just all you need, is someone to just bring things together, go, okay, well, I understand where you're coming from. I also understand yours. Let's get some common ground. Also, if you were ever to go to court, the courts really like the fact that you've tried mediation before. Is also very, very cost effective if you've got the time to do that. So I would always suggest, if things are getting a little bit tense, try and have a meeting. If they won't, be more official and ask to mediate, because before a dispute fully crystallizes, or if a dispute is crystallized. Adjudication is, as I said, rough justice. If you've got a shut and cut case, then I highly recommend it, especially if it's the fact you've done an application for payment and they haven't certified it. However, I will often use this in a situation with my clients where I've had a number of clients over the last few years that are having troubles getting paid by their clients. So I'd have a look at the circumstances. I mean, it's absolutely gobsmacks me how blasé some of these clients can be. Oh, it's no problem. Okay, it's no problem. My contractor's out of pocket. They've paid for all the materials. You've got the benefit of the materials in your building. They've paid all their subcontractors. They just want to get paid. And you're just so blasé about, oh, it's okay. And just don't issue the information. And what I would say to them is, right, this is the situation that my client's in. And you're not understanding severity of the situation. We can adjudicate. And I'm going to explain to you why we can adjudicate. This is your terms. This is your contract. This is what you've done. This is what they've done. This is the situation. We will go to adjudication. There is a dispute. However, I'm going to give you this opportunity to go to mediation first because it can be much quicker and cheaper and easier to resolve as a first step. Or let's get around the table first. Let's have a conversation. If not, we're going to go to adjudication. And adjudication, as I said, is stressful. It's not easy. And if you haven't got all your ducks in a row, if you haven't got your extension of time done, if you haven't got your records, if you haven't been issuing your applications for payments, if you don't have photos of what you've done, if you don't have the evidence and looked at your entire contract as if you were going to go to dispute and you haven't got it prepared, like I've been telling people for the last 7 episodes of how to prepare for that, then it can be quite stressful retrofitting, getting information for a year, 18 months sometimes in these contracts, going through emails, people might have left. It's complicated to go to adjudication if you don't have all your information where it should be. So just to reaffirm, if you do things properly in the first place, if you get to dispute stage, it's so much easier to do. But ultimately, if you have the right to adjudicate and you go to a client and say, right, we've got the right to adjudicate for this reason, we're going to ask the adjudicators for you to pay the cost because you haven't done X, Y, Z, even before you do a pre-action protocol letter, sometimes that's enough to open their eyes and get them around the table. But it can be a bit difficult and people do get a bit frosty when you start to talk about dispute. But I generally recommend trying to take the softer route. When my clients come to me and I have a look at their contract, I have a look at the situation, I find where their final account is or where their application for payment is, and I say, these are your options. I will then say to my clients, look, you've got 3 levels. I can send a fairly firm email saying we're not doing this and see how that goes. I can have a phone call. We can get a little bit more aggressive or we can go atomic. What do you want to do with this? I tend to recommend I send a pretty firm email. They get a bit excited. They often phone my client, who's this person? Why is she getting contractual? No one likes to get contractual when you're the one in the wrong, and all these things, and support my clients through that. And then I'll just reaffirm and keep repeating what I'm saying. A bit like when you've got children, to be fair, and you want them to do something, just keep repeating and keep repeating, keep repeating. And then after a while, if they don't get it, it's like we up the game a little bit and my angry voice comes out. But I try to keep amicable as much as I can because that's how things can be salvaged. But also, if you are amicable to start with and you're firm and you've set boundaries, people don't like boundaries, doesn't matter where you are in life, they don't like them, but they're necessary. You can still have relationships. I've had so many circumstances where I've had a director phoning my client going, who the hell is this woman? Who's Michelle Carr? Why is she being aggressive? Why is she being contractual? We don't need to go down that road. And my client will be, but that's what I pay her for. And actually, you owe me £80,000 or £120,000 or £1 million. I want my money. That's her point. You can't just be all blasé about, well, we're not going to, oh, of course we're going to pay you, but you haven't. And everyone's happy for you to do the work. And everyone knows that by the time you're getting paid, you've already outlaid most of it, or you're paying interest on what you have outlaid. And I know that I've got them. And then the amount of times that I've walked into these meetings, big fancy building in Liverpool Street or whatever it is, I'm like, oh, do you think they're trying to intimidate us? Like 12 solicitors, and everyone tries to crush my hand when I'm shaking their hand at the beginning of the meeting. And the amount of times at the end of that meeting, they shake my hand and they hold it with both hands. They look me in the eye and they thank me because actually they were in the wrong. I've saved them a lot of time and a lot of money. And so many times after that, the relationship is strengthened between my client and their client. And I always like to relate back to personal relationships. I mean, how many times have you had a friendship or relationship and you've had an argument and you've got things out in the open, but actually that argument strengthens your relationship? When we're in romantic relationships and you have your first argument, like that can be make or break. But sometimes when you've had that argument, you've got to that point and you've set that boundary, it makes you stronger. It's the same with friendships. It's the same with business. I had one client that came to me, it was just before Christmas a few years ago. They had a payment of 90,000 was due, and it was due the day we broke up for Christmas. So they had a payment certificate, everything was fine. They paid all their subcontractors, paid all their suppliers. Literally on the morning that they were breaking up for Christmas, they got a pay less notice of 0. So they came to me panicking because this was a lot of money. Where's the contract? Anyway, it transpires that they were on a purchase order for a £2 million contract. A purchase order that stated all information before this was null and void. There was no warranties, there was no this, there's no that. What they've done is actually illegal. There was nothing in the contract or in the purchase order that allowed them to do this. So let's have a look at it. I was like, this is a purchase order. So this is what I'm going to advise the client. And they all got aggressive. The contract director got on the phone. Well, you've agreed the contract, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, we haven't agreed the contract because your purchase order actually writes off everything before. So all these contracts that you send are null and void because that's what your purchase order says. So you don't have a warranty. You're paying £2 million for a system with no warranty. And you're already 1.5 million in. You've got nothing. And then I looked at their contract, and what they'd done is they copied and pasted bits and pieces, but actually one part of the contract wrote out another part of the contract. So I started saying, you haven't read the contract, you're not understanding. In the end, I sent an email in capital letters, you need to read your contract. The guy then paid attention. We had this meeting. So he was like, give me examples. I'm not giving you examples. Read your goddamn contract. Like, where's clause this? There isn't one. Where's this? There isn't one. This here you've written, you then write it out here. So actually, none of the particulars for your contract make any difference. It was an IET contract. So then we sat in this meeting. The next minute, he's looking at his solicitor going, yeah, where is this clause? Because I've looked at it. Because he wanted to prove me wrong, but he couldn't. And what we ended up doing was we renegotiated a contract that worked for them and my client. And where we were at dispute and potential, I don't know what the outcome was going, because there wasn't an ADR option in the purchase order. So it would have been litigation, which would have cost them an absolute fortune. So we ended up going to something that was really aggressive. They were all trying to chuck me off the project. And then we ended up having a 6-hour meeting, which was lengthy. I ended up getting my client extension of time. I got him better terms. I got him better agreement. The client was happy. They thanked me for it, even though it cost them another 120,000. My client got what he needed and actually made some profit because he hadn't priced the job properly in the first place. We renegotiated it. They were happy with what they got. They got a better product for the price. My client got a better price for their product. And since then, on that same one contract, which didn't cost my client a huge amount of money for me to negotiate in comparison, they've had 3 other projects on that same contract. So as much as people avoid dispute resolution, actually it strengthens relationships. Adjudication can be a bit bitter because the adjudicator decides which way it is. So I always recommend people try to mediate before they go to adjudication. And adjudication should really be a last resort. But again, it's there to protect you. And if you've got a client which just isn't playing ball, to get their attention, often you can go to adjudication and then they'll play ball afterwards. But I've had so many clients and I've had so many subcontractors that have said, right, we're in dispute. And actually, I kind of respect the fact that they say, hey, this isn't right. We've done this, we've done that. And I will say to my clients, if I'm their consultant, commercial manager, commercial director, whatever it may be that I've been acting on their behalf, these people have got every right to say what they're saying. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You need to take them seriously. And just because you get contractual with someone doesn't mean that it's going to get nasty. And actually, if you set your boundaries and say, this is what we want, it can be rectified depending on how you do it. So I'm a firm believer in mediation is where you should start, at least with a conversation. Let's have it out and discuss it. If that doesn't quite work, you can't come to a solution by yourselves, then get a mediator involved who sits there and chairs it. They're impartial and they just give their opinion and try and get the conversation to move so you can come to a mutual understanding and agreement. That's their role. Regardless of who instructs them, they have to be impartial. I have to be impartial regardless of who employs me because I'm chartered and that's what we need to do. And then if you have to go to adjudication, but make sure you're getting the right professional. Even if it's mitigation, even if it's someone that's negotiating on your behalf, if you want to get some advice, if you want to go to adjudication, you have to do your research and get a right person with the right experience for your particular problem. So you will have mediators that have experience in construction. You don't necessarily have to have a mediator that's got a lot of experience in construction. It depends on what the issues are. I've even recommended clients that I work with that are a family-run business or there's multiple directors that aren't getting on. I will refer them to mediation because actually some of the problems with your contracts are the fact that you've got 2 directors that aren't aligned, which is causing problems with your situation with your product. And sometimes I go, hey, yeah, we've got this issue over here with a contract, but actually you guys have got a bigger issue here because you're not working together. So actually we need to get a mediator in to sort your issues out, to see where this business is going. And if one of them is checked out of the business, then sometimes we just need to get them out of the business. But also this is affecting the project. And a lot of the time over the last 20 years of me going into contracts that are in trouble, most of the issues that are being reflected in the contract itself and where it's having problems go back to the business and the business issue. So you have alternative dispute resolution. It is part of the contract for the project that you're delivering, but it's also available within your business, within your network, within your subcontractors and your supply chains. Like, it's an overall thing. So as much as I talk about ADR and ADR work, it's usually on a contract that's not quite running the way it should be. Alternative dispute resolution is available for everyone. And I do think that mediation is a hidden gem that people don't really understand within business. And I will often feel like a mediator. I'm not a mediator, and I'm not a mediator trained, and I can't do mediation. But I can sit there and help clients come to a mutual decision and try and get over the dispute before it actually crystallizes. But it's very common to have disputes within a business itself, and mediation is incredible for that. I've got a number of people that I work with, and there's a few people that I recommend, and a lot of them are very used to working in family-run businesses. I've got a lot of experience in family-run business myself. I grew up in one. I understand the dynamics of working in a family-run business. I totally get it. I've lived it. So I will always recommend to certain people, especially if you've got a family-run business, when you've got different directors are pulling the business in different directions, to bring in a mediator. Dispute resolution is not just about a contractor's in trouble. My point is it can help all businesses in getting people aligned, getting your business how it needs to be, sorting out problems. Even if it was two managers, for example, in your business, look at dispute resolution throughout your business and your business relationships, not just when you've got a project that's in trouble. Because when you've got problems within your business, you're going to have problems on your side. Because if your business isn't functioning the way it's supposed to be doing, if things aren't moving the way they're supposed to move, if you haven't got teams that are aligned, the vision of the business isn't aligned, directors aren't aligned, the management isn't aligned, the systems aren't aligned. If things aren't aligned within your business, they're going to come out in your projects, and that's where they're going to cost you money. So as much as people listening to this that want to listen to a podcast on ADR would expect me to just talk about dispute resolution of a project, I want to change the way that people look at it, because actually, in a lot of my experience, where I come in to fix a project that is in trouble, it's usually because the company are in trouble, and I see the same repeat issues. It could be a dry lining contractor compared to an M&E contractor. It could be a developer compared to a subcontractor. But there are many habits and many things that I see repeated again and again and again in different businesses. And it's very good for me because it's easy for me to fix. But it's surprising how many repeat action scenarios, people, situations there are throughout the industry that end up resulting in projects that are failing or delayed or having issues. Not everyone's perfect, not everyone's innocent, but it's all about working together to get through the situation that you're in. So you're in a contract, you've got a project to deliver, let's get around the table, let's discuss what we're going to do. And if it comes to it, you've got to get contractual, then the idea of agreeing the contract in the first place, you've got that support to move you forward. So the recap, ADR is alternative dispute resolution. Obviously, you have mediation, which is where you have a mediator in. My first port of call is obviously trying to agree it around the table, communicate with people and express your position. If that doesn't work, bring in a mediator who is a professional that you can employ that is impartial. You present your case, they present their case, and a mediator tries to help you come to a mutual decision. You've then got adjudication, which is a bit more formal. That is quite stringent in the way that you need to do that. You've got your low value dispute adjudication where the costs are limited, and that is for disputes that are less than 100,000 and not complex. You can have disputes for less than 100,000 that goes through the standard route of adjudication, but that's because they're complex. So depending on who you are, you can ask for whether you think your particular dispute is low value or not, and the adjudicator will come back and say yes or no. And then obviously you've got the standard adjudication. Further than that, there is arbitration, but I would avoid arbitration if possible because it's lengthy and very expensive. Unless it's worth that big process, and I would avoid it. And most of the clients that I deal with try to avoid arbitration because the only people that really win in that is the solicitors, and most decent solicitors will avoid that too. Always when you're looking at dispute, there is an issue, speak to a consultant as quickly as you can to get the right advice to make sure that you can do damage limitation, make sure you've got the right person that's got the experience to prepare your adjudication, your pre-action protocol letters, whatever it may be. You'll need a different level of expertise depending on what your dispute is. Make sure that your team are doing the certificates as they're supposed to, and you're actually administrating the contract as you are legally entitled to do. And then at all costs, try to avoid dispute, which is always my aim. But if it comes to it, make sure you've got the right professionals to hand. Use mediation as much as possible. I highly recommend it.
Michelle, thank you for such a comprehensive look at alternative dispute resolution and your extremely valuable insight that issues don't just start with projects, but within businesses too. There's a common theme here: communication. Thank you so much, Michelle.
You're very welcome.
If you found value in today's episode, hit subscribe so you never miss a new release, and share it with someone in the industry who needs to hear it. To learn more, access resources, or find out how Michelle Carr and Construction Alchemy can help you protect your projects, solve problems, and boost your profits, visit constructionalchemy.co.uk. Together, we can change the industry, one project, one company, and one episode at a time. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are based on the personal experiences of Michelle Carr and her guests. They are for general information only and should not be relied upon as professional or legal advice. Always seek your own independent advice before making decisions. Neither Michelle Carr nor Construction Alchemy accepts liability for any loss, damage, or consequences arising from actions taken based on this podcast. Thank you for listening.